don't. But I have this story from my wife, and this is the perfect picture of redeemed here. Redeems. This is my wife. We did a chicken barbecue, and we had a prize store at the end. So if how many they sold, they got chicken bucks, and they got to go in and buy things from the store. She said, I donated some of the kids' stuffed animals to the prize store last year. And this year, when I set everything up, Brooke recognized one of her old corduroy stuffed bears. They had two of them, so my wife took one. Brooke then decided that her other corduroy bear, still at home, was her favorite stuffed animal. She has never really played with it much before. And she told me the item she really wanted from the prize store is the other bear that used to be hers. This bear was being sold for $30 chicken bucks in the middle of tons of cool toys that were being sold for far more. She had 250 chicken bucks to spend on prize store that day. Sure enough, the first thing she brought was her old bear. I had tried to get rid of it. She told me that now she has twin bears, Corduroy and Ryan. So I just couldn't believe my wife, made her buy back her bear that she had kidnapped and tried to get sold off sold off in there and made her. I'm like, at least you give the kid the bear back for free. You think you'd do that, but that's a good picture of redeemed. It's something Jesus brought us back with His blood. And that's what it is. That's what that kid loved that bear enough to buy it back, even though he already had one. She suddenly cared about it. She didn't care about it before, but we have been redeemed. Amen. All right. So we are looking at the Bible here. The book is I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And this is one we've gone through. We can know truth. We know that there is a God. And the next thing that people try to attack, people that believe in God, maybe different religions or skeptics, they will try to attack the veracity of the Bible. Okay? If I can undermine the Bible and poke holes in it, then the whole thing collapses. And that's really their goal. And they have these arguments against the Bible, and we're kind of just debunking some of those arguments. And really the two questions are, do we have manuscript evidence? Does it go far back? Do we have eyewitness evidence? What sort of evidence do we have about the Bible? They're trying to poke holes in it. So we looked at the one of their arguments. Are the New Testament documents dated early? Okay, we mentioned that they are absolutely, because we know they're quoted they're quoted by some church fathers in AD 100 and 95. A bunch of books are quoted. So we know that that's at the latest, that it's 100 AD. But it's even earlier. We talked about most of them, probably all of them were written before 70 AD. It's 40 years after the death of Jesus. So we're talking about what happened in 70 AD. Destruction of Jerusalem, the temple. Okay, this was the temple. We talked about this is the center of their life. Okay, they had to worship in the temple there. They weren't just allowed to set up their own little temple. It was just the center. That's the capital of the country, and it's the most important thing. They built this beautiful temple that was built, and Jesus predicted that it would be destroyed. Okay, and then what happened? It's destroyed. Okay. So the question is, if you and your followers write accounts of Jesus after the temple and the city were destroyed in AD 70, aren't you going to at least mention that it was destroyed, right? Okay, everything, this is the center of their national, human, economic, religious tragedy. So you think somebody somewhere would have written, hey, this happened, but they're all writing it as if it's still there. Here's the problem for those who say the New Testament was written after 70. There's absolutely no mention of the fulfillment of the prophecy. Okay, if Jesus predicted it and it happened, you think they would kind of include that? Like, this is amazing. Like, who would have thought that thing's been there for thousands of years? Many hundreds of years. And it's destroyed. Nobody would have thought that thing was going to be destroyed. The temple, you think they would be mentioning it. Of course you would. Okay, this is a shocking fulfillment of prophecy. So we know that they would. It's not mentioned in any of the documents. So some may object. They may say it's an argument from silence. It doesn't prove anything. But the New Testament documents speak of Jerusalem and the temple activities there as if they were still intact at the time of the writings. Okay, so there's mentions, talks about Jerusalem. I mean, this thing has been decimated. It's been destroyed. Okay, Jerusalem, the capital. I mean, do you think that would come up if Washington, D.C., the capital, everything got totally destroyed? Okay, it was a war, and army came in and killed thousands of people and destroyed our capital and the whole capital city. And you wouldn't write a book like it was still there, right? Okay. Even if this is an argument for silence, it doesn't mean it's wrong. Consider the modern parallel. Imagine if a tenant of the World Trade Center wrote a book about the history of the Trade Center, the World Trade Center, and they wrote about it. It ends with the towers still standing. Okay, there's absolutely no mention of the towers being destroyed, nearly 3,000 people being killed by Muslim terrorists. Do you have any doubt that this book is written before September 11th, 2001? Right? We would look at that and say, yeah, that definitely didn't happen. That would have been mentioned in the history of the Twin Trade Towers that they got destroyed. The disaster in AD 70 in terms of lives, property, and national scope was many magnitudes greater than 9/11. It marked the end of such a terrible war that Josephus, who himself surrendered to the Romans in 67, called it the greatest war of all time. Okay, this is a big deal. The Jews didn't lose a couple of prominent buildings. They lost their entire country, their capital city, their temple, which had been the center of their religious, political, and economic life for the last 1,000 years. In addition, tens of thousands of their countrymen were dead, and hundreds of their villages burned to the ground. Okay, I want you to think of that too. We think tens of thousands. I don't know what the population was back then, but I'll tell you this, the population, I looked it up, of Israel is just under 10 million. Okay, so think about what we did in 9/11. We invaded 2 countries because of that. How many died? 3,000. And I was just thinking about the recent attacks. How many died on October 7th? 1,000, right? Well, think about, okay, America, we have a population of 36 million, right? 360 million, sorry. 360 million. And we had 3,000 died. Look at that comparison, 1,000 people. Our population is 36 times that of Israel. So that's the equivalent of 36, when they lost 1,000 people, that's the equivalent of losing 36,000 people on the scale of tragedy. Can you imagine how huge that would be? We know how huge September 11th was with 3,000 people and a population of 36 million. Imagine losing 1,000 people in a population of 10 million. And here they lost tens of thousands of their countrymen. Their capital is razed. So we would expect the tragedy of 9/11 to be mentioned in the relevant writings of today. We certainly shouldn't expect the events of AD 70 to be, we would expect them to be cited somewhere in the New Testament, wouldn't we? If it's written after 70 AD, that's just, man, you can't get any bigger of an event in Israel and in Jerusalem than that. The whole city's destroyed. The amazing thing is, Jesus predicted it. He said what? No stone would be left upon another. And I read this years ago, and I couldn't find it again. I looked it up real quick. But they said the reason that they did that was because they were destroying the stones and they were melting it down for gold, because things were laid with gold and they were burning everything. And that's why they really destroyed it so completely, was where they were trying to recover any gold they could from the temple. And so the prophecy was fulfilled. But since the New Testament does not mention these events anywhere and suggests that Jerusalem and the temple are still intact, we can conclude reasonably that most, if not all, the New Testament documents must have been written prior to 70. So how much earlier? So we're working our way back here. This is an argument. It was written so far after the event, we can't trust it, is their argument. And then the Muslims will say what? He didn't resurrect, and they wrote that 400 years later. Okay, trust me, that's accurate. 400 years later, but 20, 30, whatever years, that's too much to verify. But that's just crazy that people will trust something written 400 years later, and then put doubt, something written, we're going closer and closer, they won't believe it. Many New Testament books were composed by 62 AD. Acts was written by 62, and at the latest, and Luke was written earlier, realistically 60 or before. If Luke was written by 80, 60, then Mark must have been written by the mid to late 50s, if not earlier. And he went into big, long evidence for that, and I won't bore you all with that, but just trust me, if you want to go through the evidence with me, I can get you that information. So most of them were written before 62. Some New Testament books were penned in the 40s and 50s AD with sources from the 30s. This is only, when did Jesus die? 33 AD, or maybe a year off, 34 AD if they, I don't know how they do that exactly. But, okay, so some of them written very shortly. There's no doubt from anyone, including most of the liberal scholars, that Paul wrote his first letter to the church at Corinth sometime between 55 and 56 AD. In this letter, Paul speaks about moral problems in the church, then proceeds to discuss controversies over tongues, prophecies, and the Lord's Supper. This, of course, demonstrates that the church of Corinth was experiencing some kind of miraculous activity and was already observing the Lord's Supper within 25 years of the resurrection. The most significant aspect of this letter is that it contains the earliest and most prominent authenticated testimony of the resurrection itself. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul's writing here the testimony received from others and the testimony that was authenticated when Christ appeared to him. 1 Corinthians 15:3 says, "For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried and he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that he was seen of about 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. After that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. And last of all, he was seen of me also as of one born out of due time." Where did Paul get what he received? He probably received it from Peter, James, when he visited in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. Why is this important? Gary Haberman points out most scholars, even the liberals, believe that their testimony was part of an early creed that dates right back to the resurrection itself, 18 months to 8 years, but some say even earlier. Okay, so we're getting closer and closer. That's their argument. Oh, it was written, after 100 years, 100 AD, it was written so far after it happened, but that's not true. There's no possible way such testimony could describe a legend because it goes right back to the time and place of the event itself. And that's another thing. Oh, it's became a legend and it's just been corrupted and, things have changed and they've exaggerated the details. If there ever was a place that a legendary resurrection could not occur, it was Jerusalem, because the Jews and the Romans were all too eager to squash Christianity and could have easily done so by parading Jesus' body around the city. Okay, obviously they didn't have his body, and they claimed it was stolen. Moreover, notice that Paul cites 14 eyewitnesses whose names are known, the 12 apostles, James and Paul himself. Cephas is the Aramaic for Peter, and then references the appearance of more than 500 others at one time. Included in that group is a skeptic, James. He's an outright enemy at the time. Paul himself, by naming so many people who could verify that Paul was saying, Paul was in effect challenging his Corinthian readers to check it out. If you're making up a story, you don't say, hey, all these people saw it, you can go talk to them. Okay, we know this is written very shortly after those people are still going to be alive, and he's saying, check this out. Bible scholar William Lilly puts it this way: what gives a special authority to the list as historical evidence is the reference to most of the 500 brethren being still alive. Paul says, in effect, if you do not believe me, you can ask them. Such a statement in an admittedly genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. So he's saying there's all these witnesses, you can ask them, you're not going to say there are all these witnesses if they weren't there, and if they're still alive, you can verify that. If the resurrection had not occurred, why would Paul give such a list of supposed eyewitnesses? He would have immediately lost all credibility with the Corinthians readers by lying so blatantly. Okay, so that's what I say. I mentioned, well, they mentioned bias, like we can't have any historical events because people are biased. Do you think the people in the Holocaust that went through it were biased? But do you think they can accurately report it? Do we not read Anne Frank's diary and say she was a little biased against the Germans, the Nazis, I'll say? Okay, but we take that as fact. And what's a reason that you would want to be very truthful and exact is what? If somebody can point something out that's not true, you can't believe anything in there, right? Okay? That's the whole Trump dossier years ago. They were able to verify that some things were just not true. He wasn't in this place at this time, and this wasn't true. Some of the stuff that you can't verify. But if you got some known lies in here, do you believe anything? No, I think it was just all made up. Okay? So there is a reason that you want to be truthful. In addition to 1 Corinthians, there are numerous other New Testament documents that were written in the 50s or earlier. Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Romans are all in this category. And we go out on a limb here that Paul, he died in the mid-60s, that everything he wrote was written before the mid-60s, before he was still alive, right? I mean, it's a great going out on a limb there, but okay, we know he must have, when he died, everything he wrote must have been written before then. It's not just conservative scholars who believe these early dates. Even some radical critics, such as atheist John A.T. Robinson, admits the New Testaments were written early. Robinson put forth that most of the New Testament books, including all 4 of the Gospels, were written between AD 40 and 65. Okay, that's 7 years, and then AD 40 is 7 years after he died. 65. I mean, I'm thinking about World War II and all the books written. I think they're still writing books. I don't think they stopped. When did that happen? 1945. Okay, it's 75, years ago that ended. And we know what happened, right? It's pretty verifiable. We know, and a lot of eyewitnesses are passing away, but we have their testimony written down. The great and once liberal archaeologist William F. Albright, after seeing how well the New Testament fit with archaeological and historical data, wrote, "We can see empathetically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after AD 80. Elsewhere, Albright said, "In my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the first century, very probably between AD 50 and 75. So we know this beyond a reasonable doubt. Most of the New Testament documents are written early, okay, but skeptics still have some objections, of course. They say the documents are not early enough. Some skeptics may think 15 to 40 year gap between the life of Christ and the writings is too wide for the testimony to be reliable, but they are mistaken. Think about events that happened 15 to 40 years ago. Anybody remember them? Okay, when historians write about those events, we don't say, oh, that's impossible. Okay, when no one can remember events from that long ago. I was reading a military book, and what happened was it was World War II, and then they got overrun, the Battle of the Bulge, and they held out till they ran out of bullets, and then they ended up getting captured, and then they were taken to a German prisoner of war camp till the end, and their story never really got out. And it was years and years, I mean like 20, 30, 40 years later, they ended up getting all these citations when the story came out, okay? But, people, and then they wrote books and stuff long after it happened. But you don't think those people remembered that day? Okay, of course, it's etched in their memory. So we can remember things. There's still books being written. I read one, and it was 2 pilots in World War II, and there was a wounded bomber, and it was flying back, and the German fighter could have shot it down, and he could see the people injured in there. He ended up escorting it back across so that the Germans wouldn't shoot it out of the sky, and it made it home safely. And then like 50 years later, they reunited, and he found, because the guy posted something in the back of a magazine, and 50 years later, they connected and the story came out, okay? But yes, so we know that things many years later can be written and people remember it. Historians today accurately write about events in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s by consulting their own memories, those of other eyewitnesses, and any written sources from the time. So yes, we know we can reconstruct things, and we have eyewitnesses and they can remember back that far, okay? This process is the same one New Testament writers used to record their documents. Like a good reporter, Luke interviewed eyewitnesses, and some New Testament writers were eyewitnesses themselves. So if you can remember 15 to 40 years quite easily, why can't they remember events 15 to 40 years ago, even further back? Why do we remember them? Because they made great emotional impact in our lives, right? Okay, some of us getting over the hill. We may not remember what we ate yesterday, but we can remember events 30, 40. I remember things when I was 4 years old. Don't ask me. I try to do these timesheets and I can't remember what I did a week ago, but I have memories, and we remember these things. Who doesn't? If you're around, remember where they were when President Kennedy was shot. Raise your hand. Anybody remember? Do you remember that? How long ago was that, Brother B.A.? 1963. So that's 60 years ago. And do you remember that vividly? Like that's etched in your mind, right? Okay. The Challenger, when that blew up, I don't remember that, but Brother B.A. remembers that. Okay, how long ago was that, Brother B.A.? 1988. Okay, I was alive. I just don't remember. I was 8. Okay, you remember that vividly, right? Where you were. Who remembers the World Trade Centers? Okay, I remember that. Remember where you were. Remember what you were thinking. And wow, I remember I was working at somebody's on the job and their TV, and it just seemed like a movie. It didn't seem real. And I just remember stopping, and we were all standing around the TV, watching it. I can remember the house, and just memories etched from 24 years ago. Okay, that are clearly vivid. Right? It made a deep emotional impact. Since they made a deep emotional impact on you, an event like the resurrection certainly would have made a deep emotional impact on the New Testament writers. You think somebody rising from the dead, you'd remember that? Yes, okay, we know that from experience. New Testament writers and the other eyewitnesses they would have consulted. It's easy to see why the history of Jesus could easily be recalled many years later, especially in a culture with an established reliance on oral testimony, okay? So we have to think back in the time. They didn't, we're going to get into that, but they had good memories, okay? That's how they passed down things, was orally. Furthermore, if the major works of the New Testament are eyewitness accounts written within 2 generations of the events, then they are not likely to be legend. Why? Because historical research indicates that a myth cannot begin to crowd out historical facts while the eyewitnesses are still alive. William Lane Craig writes, the tests show that even 2 generations is too short to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. Inside of those 2 generations, eyewitnesses are still around to correct the errors of historical revisionists. We see that tendency with the Holocaust. What are we hearing? More and more Holocaust denialism as the witnesses, pass away. The problem is we have so many books and so much recorded stuff, and people have read, and we have video that's you can't really get rid of as evidence, and they can't really deny some of the stuff when they went in there in these camps. So they're still trying to say it didn't happen or it wasn't as bad as they can. So there's video and just written testimony, even though people are trying to push that it never happened or it wasn't as bad. But we have eyewitness written accounts and books. Okay, but they're trying to rewrite it. Most of the eyewitnesses have now died. Fortunately, we have written eyewitness testimony from the Holocaust. The revisionists are not successful in passing off their lies as truth. The same holds true for the New Testament. If the New Testament was written within 60 years of the event it records, it is highly unlikely those events could be legendary. And as we have seen, all the New Testament documents were written within 60 years of the event, many much earlier. Okay, so the question is, the skeptics said, why not earlier? Why didn't they write it down right away when they saw it? They say, fine, the New Testament is early, not as early as we would expect. Why didn't they write their testimony down earlier? Why would you wait 15 to 20 years to write it down? Good question. A number of possible reasons for the wait. Since the first New Testament writers were living in a culture where the vast majority of people were illiterate, there was no initial need or utility in writing it down. First century people in Palestine, by necessity, developed strong memories in order to remember and pass on information. Okay, so it's a lot of illiterate people. They've just been trained. Just think of what cell phones has done to us. Think of all the things you had to remember, all the phone numbers you had. Cell phones, what? We don't memorize anything. I don't even know my wife's number, to be honest. I gotta admit it. I just hit candy. I don't type the numbers in there. Any number I have memorized was pre-cell phone days when my life depended on it, and I'm in the middle of nowhere and I gotta call somebody and I gotta go to a payphone and I gotta remember that number, right? Okay, so we can see the difference just in generation one technology, how much better our memories were. Now we think, well, I can just look it up, and I got it at my fingertips. I don't have to, why do I have to go to school? I can just look it up and Google it, right, Brother B.A.? It's just, all the information's there. I don't need to know anything. It's all right there on my phone. Okay, that's changed us. Okay, and you think about they're illiterate, they just think of the abundance of paper and books and stuff. They didn't have all that stuff. And so it's an oral culture there. That's how they pass things on, so you got to have a good memory. Craig writes, in an oral culture like that of the first century Palestine, the ability to memorize and retain large tracts of oral tradition was a highly prized and highly developed skill. From the earliest age, children in the home, elementary school, and the synagogue were taught to memorize faithfully sacred tradition. The disciples would have exercised similar care with the teachings of Jesus. In such an oral culture, facts about Jesus may have been put in a memorable form. There's good evidence for this. Gary Haberman has identified 41 short sections of the New Testament that appear to be creeds. Compact sayings that could be easily remembered were probably passed along orally before they were put into writings. They wrote these creeds down and they made the kids memorize them. People memorized them. Second, since some of the New Testament writers may have high hopes that Jesus was going to come back in this lifetime, they saw no immediate need to write it down. So they're looking, Jesus is coming back. Why do I need to record this? You know, they're not thinking thousands of years in the future. They're thinking he's coming back. There's no need. As they aged, perhaps they thought it would be wise to put their observations down on papyrus. So thirdly, as Christians spread all over the ancient world, writing became a more efficient means to communicate with the rapidly expanding church. In other words, time and distance forced the New Testament writers to write it down. Okay? On the other hand, there may not have been a gap for at least one gospel. If those fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls we talked about earlier are really from Mark, they most likely are, then the gospel might have been written in the 30s. Why? Because the fragments are copies, not the original. If we have copies from the 50s, then the original must have been earlier. So they really did write it shortly after. Okay, and then a lot of other ones were written a little bit later. But yes, we can remember events 15, 20 years. You said Kennedy was 60 years ago? You could probably write about it right now, right? And remember where you were and some details, right? Okay. Yes, we can remember. Why not more? Why is not more written about it? Okay, skeptics may ask, if Jesus actually did rise from the dead, shouldn't there be more written about him than there is? In response, we actually have more testimony than we might expect, certainly more than enough to establish beyond a reasonable doubt what happened. And here's the problem. The skeptic is never going to be satisfied with the evidence. When they don't want to believe something, it's, well, why isn't there more? I need more and more and more. If they had more, they wouldn't be convinced. They would still want more. Okay, but we're establishing a bar beyond reasonable doubt. As we have seen, Jesus is referenced by far more authors than the Roman emperor at the time. So this they want to say, oh, why wasn't more written about him? The most powerful ruler of the time, of Jesus' time, the most powerful empire at the time, and more was written about Jesus than him. That's pretty amazing. Jesus had 43 authors to Tiberius's 10 within 150 years of their lives. Okay, that's amazing. 9 of those authors were eyewitnesses or contemporaries of the events, and they wrote 27 documents. the majority of which mention or imply the resurrection. So this was written about. For those who still think there should have been more written about Jesus, New Testament scholar Craig Bloomberg offers 4 reasons why that's not a reasonable expectation. Number 1, humble beginnings of Christianity. 2, the remote location of Palestine on the eastern frontiers of the Roman Empire. 3, the small percentage of the works of ancient Greco-Roman historians that have survived. This could be due to loss, decay, destruction, or all the above. So we're asking these documents from 2,000 years ago to have survived. Very little survived. And 4, the lack of attention paid to surviving historical documents to Jewish figures in general. Nevertheless, some skeptics think, what about the testimony from the 500? Why didn't they all write it down? Well, allegedly saw the risen Christ. Skeptic Farrell Till is one of them. During a debate on the resurrection that Norm had with him, Till demanded, trot out one of those 500 witnesses or give us something that they wrote, and we will accept that as reliable proof or evidence. What are they saying? If we had just one more, do you think if they found a document that was written by one of those people that they would suddenly change? They would say, that's not enough, okay? They would say what? They're biased, right? That's what they would say, because they throw the other ones in that category. We talked about that. They say they're biased, we can't trust them, okay? So to ask for proof that they know isn't there is just ridiculous, okay? That is an unreasonable expectation for a number of reasons. First, as we already pointed out, first century Palestine was an oral culture. Most people were illiterate. Remembered and passed on information orally. So we think, oh, they're ignorant, but they probably had amazing memories and didn't forget, 7-digit phone numbers as soon as you say them, or somebody's name. I'm sure they were a lot better than we are. Second, how many of these predominantly illiterate eyewitnesses would have written something even if they could write? Even today, with a much higher literacy rate and all the conveniences of modern writing and research tools, how many people do you know have written a book or an article? Okay. How many people do you know have written a historical book to record events? Okay. A contemporary historical event, even a significant event like 9/11. Who wrote down anything about 9/11? Okay. I don't have a diary or anything. I didn't write anything. I know it happened. It impacted me, and I remember it. Okay. But I didn't sit there and write it down and record it. Okay, probably not many. Certainly fewer than 1 out of 500, right? Okay, you're just expecting, he says, has Farrell Till ever written an article or on a major historical event he witnessed? So he's expecting these people to do it, and he hasn't done it himself, but we just expect these 500 illiterate people thousands of years ago to have written it and for it to have survived, right? So what if they all did read and write, and they all wrote it in their diaries? Now you expect that diary to somehow survive a couple thousand years, okay? That's a big ask, isn't it? That somebody's carefully preserving, somebody's diary of an event or whatever happened. They don't have all social media where you can post all this stuff, and we have computers and we can write and store information. They don't have all that. But we expect somebody to record it, and it's not only to be recorded, but to survive a couple thousand years ago. Who's getting their grandparents' diary and copying it out and making a bunch of copies and hoping their kids and their grandkids and whoever will keep copying this event, okay? That's just an unreasonable expectation. Historical works from the major ancient historians such as Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny survive on only just a handful of copies, and those copies are hundreds of years from the originals. So even the greatest historians, the most well-known historians that we only have a few documents from them. So we accept random people to have their preserved documents from 2,000 years. You think anything I write is going to be preserved 2,000 years from now? Not much of a chance. Okay, so even these great historians, there's very little that survived, and they had to keep copying it. They don't have the printing press. They can't just print it and keep printing off a bunch of copies. We can run to the copier and print off as many copies as we want. They had to write everything by hand. Why do the skeptics think anything is going to be written, much less survive, from an ancient group of illiterate Galilean peasants? Okay, the amount of proof they expect is just unreasonable, right? It's amazing what has survived. We said the documents of the Bible are more than the top 10 historical documents of the time. Okay, so it's amazing that the Bible has been preserved, and that's still not enough for them. Okay, it's just, you're not going to convince them. Finally, we do know the names of many of the 500, and their testimony is written down in the New Testament. They include Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, and James, plus 9 who are named elsewhere as apostles. So we shouldn't expect more testimony than we have about Jesus, and what we do have is more than enough to establish historical accuracy. Okay, you're never going to please the atheist or the skeptic that doesn't want to be pleased. They're always going to want more. So quick summary, we can draw 2 major conclusions at this point. We do have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents, number 1. The original New Testament documents do not survive and have yet to be found. We have abundant and accurate copies of the original New Testament documents, many more than for the best 10 pieces of ancient literature combined. Okay, so this argument, we don't have the copies. We have more. We trust those other historical documents, don't we? The skeptics don't put, it's only the Bible that they attack and say you can't be trusted. So we have more manuscripts than the top 10 pieces of ancient literature combined. Moreover, perfect reconstruction of the originals can be accomplished by comparing the thousands of manuscript copies that do survive. They've discovered manuscripts and fragments, and they can compare them from the early 2nd century and perhaps as early as the mid-1st century. There are no works from the ancient world even come close to the New Testament in terms of manuscript support. Okay, so this is their thing. We can't trust the Bible. It's been corrupted. That's what the Muslims say. They're the words of Allah, but it's been corrupted. Okay, well, we can show that they haven't. Reconstruction is further authenticated by thousands of quotations we mentioned from the Church Fathers. They've quoted, I think, everything in the New Testament except 11 verses. Okay, and so that's like going back and destroying every biblical copy, but we've got tapes of preachers, and they're quoting verses in their messages, and we can reconstruct it from that. The New Testament, number 2, is the New Testament documents are early and contain even earlier source material. We know that they're referred to by the Church Fathers from at least 100. We know that, so it had to be earlier than that. We know the New Testament speaks of the temple as if it was still there. Okay, and nobody records that. It's not recorded. Why would they talk about it as if it's still there? If it's not, somebody would have written about such a major event. I mean, we still, bombing of Pearl Harbor, we still, 9/11, those are major events that we still recognize many years later, and they have no mention of that, so we know most of it was probably written before 70. We have strong evidence that Acts was written by 62, which means Luke is even earlier, so we know these things were written pretty early. We have source material that goes back into the 30s. Nearly all scholars agree that the death, burial, and resurrection found in 1 Corinthians 15 comes from the time of those events or within a few years of them. Furthermore, there are at least 40 other creeds in the New Testament that appear to be of very early origin. So we're just looking at the reliability of the Scriptures. Can we trust them? This is what the devil wants to go after. Okay, the reliability of the Scripture. You look at the Muslims, what do they say? It's been corrupted, and then they say the resurrection happened. Why? Because that's really the basis of the Bible. Jesus coming and dying and rising again. They can accept everything else, but they can't take that. They'll say, oh, we love Jesus, the Muslims will say, and they'll say, he was a prophet, but they don't want to admit he was God, and they don't want to admit that he resurrected from the grave, so they got to undermine the Bible and the accounts in the Bible. So the documents in closing are early, and the sources are even earlier. That's not enough to prove historicity beyond a reasonable doubt. To prove historicity, we need to be sure that these documents really contain eyewitness testimony. So we're going to look at that next. That's the next question that we're going to investigate. Eyewitness accounts, can we trust them? Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we love you, dear Lord. Just thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your word, dear Lord, and just that you have promised you would preserve it, and you have, dear Lord. And we love you in Jesus' name. Amen.